The first time, the ocean went completely silent. I knew something was wrong, because even miles below the surface, the sea is never truly quiet. I remember gripping the cold metal ladder and thinking about the list they made me memorize on my first day. The list of 11 strange rules they said would keep me alive down here. I used to laugh at them, especially the ones about doors and hatches, because I trusted steel more than superstition. But silence changes how you think, and it makes old warnings feel heavier. I broke one rule that night without meaning to, and the ocean responded. I still don't know if it noticed me, or if it was waiting all along. The first time the silence truly hit me, I realized how fragile life felt even behind steel walls. The submarine had always hummed, a constant low vibration that reminded me we were suspended in the abyss, held together by engineering and luck. But that night, the hum disappeared, leaving a weight in the air I couldn't measure. I remembered Rule 1, never open a hatch when the ocean is silent, a line I had once thought was exaggeration. Now it felt alive, like it had crawled into my mind and refused to leave. I had learned the rule on my first week here, during a briefing in a room that smelled of metal and recycled air. The senior engineer spoke quietly, almost hesitantly, as if the words themselves carried danger. He said silence wasn't the absence of sound, it was the absence of certainty. Rule 1, never open a hatch when the ocean is silent, he had said, isn't about the hatch, it's about what's waiting to see if you're careless. Back then, I had shrugged and laughed. Now I clutched my wrench like a talisman, remembering every word. The auxiliary hatch at the far end of the maintenance bay seemed ordinary, dull metal scuffed from decades of service. I passed it countless times without thinking, but now it loomed like an object of warning. The silence pressed down around me, and I noticed how even my breathing sounded loud, echoing against the curved walls. I tried to ignore it, tightening a panel on the wall, telling myself it was nerves. Yet my eyes kept drifting to the wheel, as if the hatch itself was drawing me closer. Keller's voice came over the comms, casual at first, asking about a minor sensor fluctuation. I told him everything was fine, though my stomach twisted. He suggested I check the auxiliary hatch just in case. An innocent precaution, he said. Better safe than sorry. I froze, recalling Rule 1, never open a hatch when the ocean is silent. It was ingrained in me, a mental stop sign that screamed don't touch. My fingers hovered near the wheel, trembling, while the silence outside seemed to tighten, like it was listening for a choice. I thought about why they had rules like this. During orientation, they'd warned us that these weren't myths, they were survival guidelines. A momentary lapse could mean something, crossing from outside to in, something no gauge could predict. I reminded myself the sub was built to withstand extreme pressure, but this wasn't about pressure, this was about presence. The water was patient, and whatever was out there didn't need permission, just an opening. The console flashed green for hull integrity, oxygen levels and power. Every instrument screamed stability. Yet instinct told me to move cautiously. I touched the wheel again, just lightly, testing its cold metal. The silence didn't shift immediately, but the space felt different, heavier somehow, more personal. I whispered the rule under my breath, hoping it would anchor me, hoping repetition made it reality. Rule 1, never open a hatch when the ocean is silent. It felt absurdly fragile, like repeating it might keep danger at bay. A soft vibration ran along the deck, subtle but noticeable, enough to make my heart pick up pace. My training urged me to check for mechanical issues, but this wasn't mechanical. The hatch seemed to resist being observed, and yet I couldn't tear my eyes away. Keller's voice again, now tense, instructed me to open it fully. Citing protocol, I froze, the words of Rule 1 flashing through my mind. No, I said quietly, more to myself than him. I can't. The comm went silent, his instructions hanging in the empty space. I glanced around, noting every detail, the rust streaks, the rivets, the subtle play of light across the bulkhead. Movement at the corner of my vision made me flinch. But when I turned, nothing was there. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears, matching the sub's mechanical heartbeat. The quiet wasn't broken. It was deliberate. It was waiting, and I realized, with a cold shiver, that the rule wasn't a guideline for humans. It was a warning for everything else. My fingers gripped the wheel again, almost involuntarily, and I thought about the older mechanic who had disappeared months ago. He had been near this hatch, alone, with the same silence pressing against him. People said it was decompression failure, an accident, but what if the silence had been there before, testing him, nudging him toward the wrong choice? I forced myself to step back. I would not be him. Rule 1. Never open a hatch when the ocean is silent was now more than words. It was survival etched into my instincts. Then a low vibration rolled through the deck, not mechanical, something alive or deliberate. The hatch wheel turned on its own, barely noticeable, but enough to confirm it didn't need me. My heart jumped into my throat as I stumbled backward, realizing the rule wasn't protecting the sub. It was protecting me from whatever had been waiting outside, whatever had been watching the silence, waiting for the hatch to open. I could feel eyes, or something like them, on my back, aware of my hesitation. The lights flickered, briefly dimming before stabilizing, and the vibration ceased. Yet the atmosphere remained tense, heavy, as if the bay itself was holding its breath. I moved to the center of the room, away from the hatch, my gloves trembling. I kept whispering Rule 1, never open a hatch when the ocean is silent, hoping repetition would be a shield. Something had acknowledged my presence, and I knew instinctively it would not forget me. The silence returned once more, patient and patient, waiting to see if I would dare again. As I settled in the bay, breathing hard, I heard a faint metallic shift behind me, too precise to be the sub itself. I didn't dare turn, fearing what might be there. The wheel hadn't moved since, yet something had tested the rule, and now I knew it could return at any moment. The vibration had barely settled when I noticed them. Shadows flickering in the corners of the maintenance bay, where the lights didn't reach. At first I thought it was a trick of my exhausted eyes, a reflection from the instruments bouncing unpredictably across the metal walls. But then I saw them move in ways steel and cables shouldn't, sliding along edges, disappearing and reappearing in different places. I remembered the words my instructor had drilled into us on the first day. Rule 2, never ignore the shadows in the machinery. At the time it had sounded abstract, a warning against laziness or oversight. Now it felt like a lifeline I desperately needed to obey. Keller's voice came through the comms again, questioning my status, and I realized that no one on the surface could see what I was seeing. I tried to describe it, to convey the way the shadows didn't belong, how they seemed aware of my presence, and how the bay felt tighter with each passing moment. He told me to check the auxiliary generator, to ensure nothing had tripped circuits, but even as I moved, the shadows shifted, leading me subtly like predators guiding prey. The lesson of Rule 2, never ignore the shadows in the machinery, replayed in my mind, each repetition heavier than the last. The first time a shadow moved against the grain of machinery, I froze. The metallic scent of the sub mixed with the faint tang of something saltier, almost organic, and it made the air feel alive. I told myself it was fatigue, the isolation, the endless hum that had just returned after the earlier silence. Yet every instinct screamed otherwise. The shadows weren't just tricks, they were aware. They followed me through corridors, under grates, lingering where I had just been, vanishing when I looked directly, only to return with renewed patience. I checked the auxiliary hatch again, half expecting the wheel to move on its own, but it remained still. The shadows, however, multiplied along the wall seams, spreading like ink across steel. My gloves tightened around my wrench, as I reminded myself of Rule 2, never ignore the shadows in the machinery, muttering it under my breath. It was more than a rule. It was a mental anchor in a world where reality bent and shifted without warning. Every movement I made felt observed. Every breath counted against me. Keller's voice came back, sharper now, ordering me to finish the system checks and confirm all conduits were clear. I hesitated, trying to explain the shadows. but words faltered in the sterile calms. The shadows seemed to understand my hesitation, leaning closer, brushing against the edge of my vision. I remembered my training, the warnings about letting fear dictate action. But Rule 2, never ignore the shadows in the machinery, was fear incarnate, and it demanded attention. I had to act, not panic, even if I couldn't rationalize what was following me. I moved carefully to the generator compartment, flashlight cutting through the dim bay, illuminating belts, cables, and panels. The shadows retreated slightly under the light, but didn't vanish completely. They lingered at the corners, always in peripheral vision, always just beyond understanding. I checked the conduits and found nothing wrong mechanically, yet the uneasy feeling persisted, as if the sub itself was warning me. It was then I realized the shadows were testing me, seeing whether I would obey Rule 2. Never ignore the shadows in the machinery, or dismiss it like I had done so many times before. My hand slipped against the metal railing, and I flinched at a sudden movement at eye level. There was no one there, only a shadow coiling and twisting, where no cables should have allowed motion. I whispered the rule again, almost like a spell. Rule 2, never ignore the shadows in the machinery, hoping repetition would anchor me in reality. But deep down, I knew this was not about reality. It was about survival, about respecting forces I couldn't see, but could feel pressing against every nerve in my body. I backed slowly toward the bay's center, trying not to provoke the shadows, trying not to step too close to the auxiliary hatch. The air felt denser, heavy with unspoken menace. I told Keller the generator was operational, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. He responded with impatience, insisting on visual confirmation from the hatch. I swallowed my fear, knowing Rule 2, never ignore the shadows in the machinery, applied to the spaces between tasks, the gaps where oversight could be fatal. As I glanced over the railing again, I realized the shadows weren't following the path of the machinery alone. They were threading through the bay, like a second, unseen layer of reality. My flashlight trembled in my grip, illuminating edges that weren't supposed to exist. I felt a pull toward one shadow in particular, a darker, denser form that seemed almost tangible. Every fiber of my training screamed to step back, but the compulsion to investigate was nearly irresistible. I reminded myself again, Rule 2, never ignore the shadows in the machinery. Obedience was survival, even when my curiosity screamed otherwise. The vibration in the hull began to pulse, low and rhythmic, syncing eerily with my heartbeat. It felt like a warning, a communication I couldn't understand but instinctively obeyed. I could feel the shadows coalescing along the walls, creeping closer as though the bay itself was alive, breathing, watching. I clenched my wrench tighter, telling myself that any mistake could cost me everything. Following Rule 2 was no longer an option. It was the only way to ensure I left the bay in one piece. Then, without warning, one shadow moved differently. It slid across the deck and stopped near the auxiliary hatch, lingering for a moment longer than physically possible. I froze, my mind screaming that I should retreat, but my body was rooted. The sub's hum returned, but this time it was uneven, distorted, like a voice trying to reach me through steel. I realized the shadows were not just passive, they were testing boundaries, probing reactions, and in that instant, I understood. Rule 2, never ignore the shadows in the machinery, was a guide not just for survival, but for avoiding what waited when rules were broken. I took a careful step back, counting slowly to 4, each number a tether to sanity. My eyes darted between panels, the hatch, and the shifting forms at the periphery. I whispered the rule again, letting it echo in my own mind. Rule 2, never ignore the shadows in the machinery. As the pulse in the hull intensified, I realized the shadows had noticed my acknowledgement. They paused, then retreated slightly, as if satisfied, for now, but I knew this was temporary. The silence would return, and the shadows would resume their watch, relentless and patient. Just as I exhaled, hoping the immediate threat had passed, a movement caught my eye, directly behind me, against the hatch I had avoided. Something solid, dark and impossibly close seemed to lean into the bay. I didn't dare look fully, but I knew one thing. The shadows weren't just tricks of light anymore. They were aware, and they were waiting for the moment. I forgot Rule 2. The sub felt heavier that morning, though nothing had changed. The hum was back, steady but unnervingly sharp, like steel straining under weight it shouldn't bear. I moved toward the control panel, knowing instinctively that I had to check the gauges. Rule 3. Always check the pressure gauges twice. Before touching anything wasn't just about preventing leaks or mechanical failure. It was about timing, awareness, and acknowledging that something unseen could punish mistakes. I ran my hand over the cold metal, counting the flickers on the dials, feeling tension coil in my chest. The first reading was normal, green indicators lined up like soldiers on parade. Yet I hesitated before adjusting the hydraulic valve, because the memory of the shadows from the previous rule lingered. Every shadow, every flicker reminded me that the bay wasn't empty. I glanced again at the pressure gauges. The second check confirmed the numbers, but now the readings seemed to shift subtly, almost as if the instruments themselves were aware of my movements. Rule 3. Always check the pressure gauges twice before touching anything, replayed like a mantra, anchoring me to caution. Keller's voice cut through the intercom, asking for confirmation on oxygen flow and cabin pressure. I answered calmly, though my hands trembled slightly. I remembered the training. Pressure isn't just about air. It's about control, about understanding the balance between the environment and what lurks outside. When the gauges pulse even slightly, it can signal a leak, an impending failure, or something far more unpredictable. The rule wasn't arbitrary. It was survival. Repeating it mentally. Rule 3. Always check the pressure gauges twice before touching anything, gave me the discipline to act, not panic. The sub's lights reflected off the panels, shadows lengthening across cables and piping. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye and froze. A cable swayed slightly, even though there was no air current. I told myself it was the sub settling, but the shadows had taught me otherwise. Each movement reminded me that vigilance wasn't optional. Following the rule meant I didn't just glance once. I scrutinized every dial, every valve, every lever. One misstep could bring consequences the gauges might never detect, and I could end up trapped, alone, under miles of ocean. I reached the hydraulic control lever but didn't touch it yet. Instead, I checked the first gauge again. It read exactly what it had before. I moved to the second, scanning it slowly, comparing readings. Nothing was wrong. The exercise felt tedious, repetitive, but Rule 3, always check the pressure gauges twice before touching anything, was a reminder that repetition could be the difference between life and death. The sub didn't forgive carelessness, and the ocean beyond the hull didn't care for human error. A subtle vibration ran along the deck, not constant, but pulsating in a rhythm that set my nerves on edge. I looked up, noticing a faint shift in the shadows cast by overhead lights. The earlier lessons, the silence, the moving shadows, loomed behind every caution. I realized that Rule 3 wasn't just about metal or mechanics. It was about patience, understanding, and resisting impulse. I could feel the water outside pressing against the hull differently, almost aware of my hesitation, almost testing me. I went over every gauge a third time, even though it seemed redundant. Each dial told the same story, but the process grounded me. I moved methodically, every motion deliberate. The pressure valves needed adjusting, but only after triple confirmation. My hands hovered over the lever, waiting for absolute certainty. The sub groaned faintly, the steel flexing, reminding me that even perfection on paper didn't mean perfection in reality. Following Rule 3, always check the pressure gauges twice before touching anything had kept me alive this far, and it would need to carry me further. Keller's voice returned, urging me to expedite the check. His tone was impatient, unaware of the shadows, the silence, and the subtle vibrations that I felt in my chest and fingertips. I ignored him, concentrating on the task. Every gauge, every pressure reading, Every tiny tremor mattered. One wrong move could unbalance everything. I could hear the faint metallic groan of the sub, like it was communicating a warning, a reminder, a threat. The repetition of the Rule 3, always check the pressure gauges twice before touching anything, became a lifeline. The shadows from earlier seemed to drift closer as I moved across the bay, lingering near the auxiliary hatch without ever touching it. I adjusted a secondary valve, double-checked the primary gauge, and felt the sub shiver under my hands. The vibrations synchronized with the sub's own heartbeat, and I realized the structure itself was alive in a way I didn't fully understand. The rule wasn't just about caution, it was about recognizing the environment as a living system that could punish arrogance. Every glance at the gauges reminded me of this, and every careful movement reaffirmed it. I paused near the hydraulic lever, counting my breaths, feeling the sub settle beneath me. The shadows flinched as I shifted my stance, retreating slightly without leaving my post. The gauges confirmed stability again. I could have acted faster, but impatience would have been fatal. I remembered older engineers talking about false security, moments when systems appear normal just before chaos strikes. Rule 3, always check the pressure gauges twice before touching anything, wasn't a rule for speed or efficiency. It was a rule for foresight, for humility in the face of unknown depths. A sudden shudder ran through the hull, subtle but unmistakable. My hand froze over the lever. The shadows coalesced briefly near the hatch, denser than before, almost tangible. I realized the sub itself wasn't threatening me. It was the unknown outside, the ocean pressing through silence, watching for mistakes. I whispered the rule once more, letting it echo through my mind. Rule 3, always check the pressure gauges twice before touching anything. It anchored me, reminding me that caution could buy me a few more seconds, maybe more. Finally, I made the adjustment, moving the lever slowly, carefully, confirming readings after each small turn. The gauges responded as expected, green lights glowing steadily. The shadows seemed to retreat slightly, but I knew it wasn't permanent. Every motion in the bay, every echo of metal, every flicker of light could draw attention back. The lesson of Rule 3 had been reinforced. Hesitation and vigilance were survival. Impatience and doubt were death. I stepped back, breathing shallowly, scanning the room. The gauges all read normal. The sub hummed evenly again. Yet my instincts screamed that it wasn't over. I had obeyed the rule, but the ocean, the shadows, and the silence had not forgotten me. I understood then that following Rule 3, always check the pressure gauges twice before touching anything, was not about completing a task. It was about sending a message. I respected the rules. I respected the unknown, and for now I would survive. Just as I exhaled, a faint vibration ran along the bulkhead, not mechanical, but alive. Something brushed the outer edge of the auxiliary hatch, a whisper of pressure against steel that didn't belong. My hand hovered near the lever again, remembering Rule 3, and I realized the sub had more secrets than I had imagined, and whatever was outside, it had noticed my vigilance. After the adjustment of the pressure valves, a strange calm settled over the bay, but I knew better than to trust it. The gauges were green, the hum steady, and yet every instinct told me that calmness often precedes the unexpected. I remembered the old warning whispered during orientation. Rule 4, never assume the hull is the only barrier. At the time it had sounded like a precaution against punctures or leaks. Now I understood, it meant more, much more. The ocean itself, or something within it, could slip through spaces humans never thought mattered. I moved toward the auxiliary hatch, keeping my flashlight low and sweeping the bay systematically. Shadows lingered in corners again, subtle movements that didn't belong to any visible object. I tried to focus on the metallic surfaces, on the gauges I had checked twice, but peripheral motion caught my eye repeatedly. The lesson of Rule 4 was clear. The hull was steel designed to keep water out, but not everything else. Some things could navigate patience and silence as easily as the water moved against our vessel. The sub's interior echoed softly with the vibrations of machinery. but there were differences now. The hum had a rhythm, almost a pulse, as if reacting to my attention and caution. My training told me to rely on instruments, yet every rule drilled into me screamed otherwise. I glanced at the panels, then back at the hatch, noticing tiny streaks in the steel, almost too fine to see, but undeniable. They didn't align with corrosion or wear. They seemed purposeful. I whispered Rule 4. Never assume the hull is the only barrier, letting the words root me in caution as I approached the suspicious streaks. Keller's voice cut through the comms, asking about the auxiliary hatch. I hesitated before answering, choosing words carefully. Everything seems fine for now, I said, trying not to sound nervous. But he pressed, telling me to open it and inspect the outside connectors. I felt the weight of all previous lessons, the silence, the shadows, the meticulous gauge checks. If I disobeyed, I risked protocol. If I obeyed, I risked something unseen slipping through. I took a deep breath and reminded myself again. Rule 4. Never assume the hull is the only barrier. I circled the hatch slowly, inspecting every bolt, every seam. Nothing looked compromised on the surface. The lights cast strange reflections along the rivets, highlighting the tiniest imperfections. My flashlight revealed faint scratches and subtle discolorations, signs that something had moved along the hull where no human hand had been. The air felt heavier, almost damp with pressure beyond measurement, and I realized that the hull was a barrier in theory, but the unknown always found a way to press against it. Rule 4. Never assume the hull is the only barrier, echoed louder now, more urgent than before. The shadows seemed to react to my movements, gathering near the edges of the bay without ever fully materializing. I stepped carefully, aware of each panel, each cable, ensuring nothing was disturbed unnecessarily. Every instinct screamed caution. I traced along the hatch with my gloves, finding faint indentations that weren't mine, as if someone or something had tested the boundaries before me. I couldn't tell if it had come through a breach, or if it was the ocean itself, but the lesson was unmistakable. The hull was not enough. Nothing ever was. Keller's voice again, more insistent now, requested visual confirmation outside the auxiliary hatch. I felt my stomach twist, torn between duty and survival instincts. I wanted to move, to follow procedure, but the lessons of Rule 4 pressed like weight on my chest. Something about this hatch felt wrong, a subtle energy, an awareness beyond comprehension. I backed away slightly, keeping my flashlight sweeping the bay, and realized that obeying the rule meant trusting my instincts more than the protocols I had memorized. The unknown always exploited assumptions. I took a deep breath and checked the secondary gauges, ensuring the hull integrity read stable across all panels. The readings were perfect, almost unnervingly so, as though the sub itself was taunting me. I considered Keller's instructions, the protocol I had sworn to follow, and the tiny scratches along the hatch seam that defied explanation. Rule 4. Never assume the hull is the only barrier became a mantra. I repeated under my breath, a protective chant against complacency. One slip could mean a breach not just in metal, but in understanding, one that might be fatal. The shadows shifted closer again, responding to my movements, the hum now vibrating subtly against my chest. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the mechanical elements, the physical checks, the repeated readings of the gauges, but instinct told me these shadows, these anomalies were testing boundaries as much as I was. The rule wasn't just about barriers of steel, it was about acknowledging limits, unseen forces, and the intelligence of the ocean. I repeated it in my mind. Rule 4. Never assume the hull is the only barrier. A low vibration ran along the deck, distinct from the hum of machinery, almost deliberate. My pulse quickened. Something brushed against the edge of the hatch, enough to make me flinch, yet nothing appeared on the sensors. I realized the sub itself wasn't the threat. Whatever existed outside, beyond, and perhaps in between, was testing me. The hull was irrelevant to it. Following Rule 4 wasn't a choice. It was a measure of whether I could survive. I moved carefully, inspecting every seam and corner, acknowledging the presence I could not see. I paused at the center of the bay, my flashlight casting long streaks across the metal. The shadows held position near the hatch, deliberate, patient, almost intelligent. I repeated the rule once more, aloud this time. Rule 4, never assume the hull is the only barrier. It anchored me, but the weight in the bay felt heavier, more aware of my acknowledgement. I could feel the space press around me, not physically, but with an attention I couldn't escape. The sub was no longer just a vessel, it was a trap, a playground, and a test. Finally, I backed toward the console, avoiding the hatch, but keeping it in sight. The shadows retreated slightly, but the lesson remained. The hull might hold against water and pressure, but not against observation, patience, or intelligence I could not comprehend. I understood that for survival, rules were not optional, they were shields, and I had just barely reinforced the truth of Rule 4. Never assume the hull is the only barrier, hoping it would be enough to keep me alive through the night. As I exhaled and glanced toward the auxiliary hatch, a faint metallic scrape echoed from the far end of the bay. The shadows didn't move, yet I felt their presence condense near the hull, waiting. The steel might hold, but I realized too late that barriers could be illusions, and something had already found its way inside. The sub had settled into a false sense of normalcy after the previous checks, but the air suddenly felt colder, unnaturally so, against my exposed skin inside the suit. I shivered despite the internal heating system functioning perfectly. The sudden drop reminded me why Rule 5, never ignore a sudden change in temperature, existed, though I had never encountered it like this. Temperature shifts were not just environmental, they were indicators, subtle warnings from the ocean itself, or something within it, waiting for a misstep. I could feel the cold pressing into my bones, and it was deliberate, calculated. I scanned the bay, flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The auxiliary hatch remained still, but the corners of the room felt different, like the cold had weight. I ran a hand along the nearest conduit, feeling the metal's chill extend further than expected. My console confirmed standard readings, yet instinct screamed otherwise. The rule wasn't about comfort, it was about awareness. Every fluctuation in temperature could signal a change in pressure, a malfunction, or something far more sinister. Rule 5, never ignore a sudden change in temperature, echoed in my mind, anchoring me. Keller's voice came through the comms, brisk and authoritative, asking if the readings were off. I told him the instruments were normal, but I could feel the sub itself shifting, reacting to the cold that seemed to seep through steel. He dismissed it as minor fluctuation, but the memory of previous lessons, silence, shadows, gauges, hull barriers, made me wary. Something in the sub was alive, testing me, pressing for attention. I repeated the rule mentally, letting Rule 5, never ignore a sudden change in temperature, guide my cautious movements as I checked the perimeter. I moved slowly toward the generator section, noting that the air seemed to grow colder with every step. It wasn't uniform. Pockets of chill hung in corners, clinging to surfaces like mist. The shadows I had learned to watch moved differently here, merging with the cold almost tangible. I realized that the sub was no longer just a machine. It was a stage, and I was part of the performance. The temperature was the first line of dialogue, subtle but meaningful, and it demanded my full attention. I whispered the rule under my breath, grounding myself in awareness. The vents hummed normally, yet I noticed condensation forming in odd places. My gloves collected slight moisture, though humidity was stable. I crouched, tracing pipes and conduits, noting differences that shouldn't exist. I checked the readings on my wrist console repeatedly, confirming that all systems were technically normal, yet the cold persisted. It was deliberate, invasive. My mind raced through possibilities, and I realized the importance of Rule 5, never ignore a sudden change in temperature. It wasn't merely a warning of mechanical issues, but a signal from forces beyond my comprehension. A sudden draft swept through the bay, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet enough to make the lights flicker briefly. I spun toward the source, flashlight slicing through the shadows, but nothing appeared out of place. The cold pressed harder against the back of my neck, like a finger tracing a warning. I remembered stories from older crew members about the sub being sensitive to outside presence, but I had dismissed them as superstition. Now I realized that sensitivity wasn't mechanical, it was deliberate, alive, and observant. Rule 5, never ignore a sudden change in temperature, became a mantra as I moved carefully, avoiding sudden actions. Keller's voice cut back, questioning my delay, but I held my ground. The cold seemed to respond to my acknowledgement, thickening in patches near corners, lingering around the auxiliary hatch. Every instinct screamed caution, reminding me that temperature was not just a metric, but a messenger. I adjusted my suit, checking seals and valves, repeating readings. The room seemed to contract, shadows tightening, and I realized that even compliance with rules might not be enough. The cold wasn't random, it was testing me, and I had to prove I understood its message. I moved to check the secondary hull, running hands over metal that felt colder than physics should allow. My flashlight reflected off faint streaks in the steel, highlighting imperfections I hadn't noticed before. The temperature shift seemed to concentrate along them, as if the steel itself was a conduit for something beyond comprehension. I muttered Rule 5, never ignore a sudden change in temperature again, letting the words tether me to reason while every nerve screamed vigilance. One wrong move could give the cold permission to escalate, and I couldn't afford that. A vibration rippled through the sub, subtle but enough to make me flinch. The cold intensified along my arms and legs, creeping slowly, a deliberate advance. I backed toward the center of the bay, keeping the flashlight sweeping the room, scanning every corner. The shadows moved in response, merging with the temperature, wrapping the space in a suffocating awareness. I realized then that the sub itself was testing boundaries, that Rule 5, never ignore a sudden change in temperature, was as much about discipline as survival. The auxiliary hatch shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if the cold had given it permission to move. My heartbeat accelerated, and I froze, hands gripping the nearest support. The room felt alive, conscious of my every hesitation. I repeated the rule aloud, letting the words carry weight. Rule 5, never ignore a sudden change in temperature. It anchored me, a lifeline against rising panic, but I knew instinctively that the cold, the shadows and the sub's subtle vibrations were far from fully tested. I crouched near the control panel, scanning readings, watching shadows, feeling the cold pressing on my neck, shoulders and wrists. The air, though measured, carried a tension, like static before a storm. I whispered the rule one last time, letting it resonate through my mind and body. Rule 5, never ignore a sudden change in temperature. Compliance alone wasn't enough. Awareness, precision, and respect for the unknown were critical. I could survive this moment, but the ocean beyond the hull was patient, watching, waiting for the tiniest lapse. As I exhaled, a chill brushed the back of my neck stronger than before, accompanied by a faint metallic rasp near the auxiliary hatch. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hands, shadows dancing unnaturally. The cold wasn't random, it was deliberate, a signal, and I realized something had already breached the perception of the hull without leaving any trace. After the unsettling cold, I realized the sub had grown quieter, not in a comforting way, but in a deliberate, oppressive silence. Every familiar hum and vibration seemed muted, leaving an emptiness that clawed at the edges of my mind. Rule 6, always listen for what isn't there, came to me, recalling the warning whispered during a long-forgotten briefing. It wasn't about the sounds the sub made. It was about the absences, the spaces between vibrations, the faintest echoes that hinted at something waiting, something aware, beyond comprehension. I moved cautiously along the corridor toward the auxiliary hatch, flashlights sweeping shadows that danced on the walls. The silence seemed heavier near the far end, pressing against the hull as if trying to communicate. I stopped at each junction, straining to catch nuances that instruments couldn't detect. The faint creak of metal under pressure, the subtle shift of air in a vent, even the absence of mechanical resonance spoke volumes. I whispered the rule under my breath, repeating it to anchor my senses. Rule 6. Always listen for what isn't there. Keller's voice broke through the comms, but it sounded distant, almost as if underwater. I answered cautiously, keeping my ears alert for anomalies. The silence around me didn't obey logic. It pulsed with intent. Shadows along the walls didn't move randomly. They flickered in sync with the absence of sound, responding to attention I didn't realize I was giving. I realized the sub itself was alive in a way I couldn't measure. Following Rule 6 meant listening beyond the obvious, hearing gaps where others heard nothing. As I approached the hatch, I noticed subtle differences in the air currents, faint enough that only attentive ears and intuition could detect them. A vent whistle that had never existed before appeared briefly, then vanished. I crouched and scanned the floor for vibrations, tiny tremors that instruments ignored. The sub felt alive, testing, observing. The rule wasn't about fear, it was about awareness, anticipation, and survival. I repeated it again. Rule 6. Always listen for what isn't there, allowing it to guide my movements and sharpen my perception. The shadows thickened near the hatch, drawn to my presence, and I realized they reacted not to noise, but to the silence between movements, between breaths. I focused on every micro vibration, my heartbeats, the hum of the machinery, the faint static in the comms. Each absence of sound became a signal, a warning. I whispered Rule 6 aloud this time, grounding myself as the bay seemed to contract and pulse around me. Ignoring the silence now could be fatal. Listening might buy me a few more moments. A faint metallic scraping echoed from the auxiliary hatch, but the source remained invisible. My flashlight trembled slightly as I scanned every inch, seeing nothing, yet sensing something. My training urged me to check systems, but instinct screamed caution. I crouched, listening, counting microseconds between echoes, realizing that Rule 6, always listen for what isn't there, demanded patience, discipline, and fearlessness. Each unspoken sound carried a warning, a direction, or a threat I could neither quantify nor fully comprehend. Keller's impatience echoed in my ear, pressing me toward action, but I resisted. The silence itself had meaning, a rhythm I could interpret if I concentrated. The sub's walls vibrated subtly underfoot, responding to the absence of normalcy, testing my focus. Every step toward the hatch was deliberate, every pause a survival tactic. The shadows lingered, slipping in and out of visibility, reminding me that obeying Rule 6 wasn't just a precaution, it was essential to staying alive in an environment where perception mattered more than action. The lights flickered, briefly dimming the bay, leaving me reliant on instinct and attentive listening. A low, irregular hum emerged, not from any machinery, but from somewhere beyond comprehension. It pulsed, faded, and returned with intention, making me freeze mid-step. The auxiliary hatch, silent and immovable, became a focal point for the absence, for the quiet warnings hidden in the bay's stillness. I reminded myself, aloud this time, Rule 6, always listen for what isn't there, trying to convince both myself and the unseen observer that I was aware, alert, and cautious. I crouched near the control panel, scanning the gauges and walls, while my ears strained to detect micro-signals. The shadows appeared denser near the corners, responding subtly to the pauses between mechanical hums. I realized that this was a game of attention, observation, and respect for forces I couldn't measure. The sub itself, the shadows, the silence, they were alive, testing, probing. Rule 6, always listen for what isn't there, wasn't just advice, it was a lifeline in a bay where neglecting absence could be deadly. The air temperature shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible change that tugged at my awareness. I froze, listening, feeling the space around me as if it were a living entity. Every vibration, every missing sound, every moment of expectation could reveal threats, anomalies, or doors I had not yet considered. The auxiliary hatch remained still, but I could feel the pressure of unseen eyes waiting for a mistake. I repeated the rule internally, letting it focus my senses. Rule 6. Always listen for what isn't there. A faint whisper of movement brushed past the far wall, almost too subtle to detect. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hands, knowing that acknowledging the presence could draw it closer. I crouched, scanning the shadows, listening to the silence, reading the pauses between every mechanical hum. The sub itself seemed to exhale slowly, as if aware of my comprehension. Obeying the rule had kept me alive this far, and it would need to carry me further. Rule 6. Always listen for what isn't there, echoed through the empty bay, a mantra and a shield. Just as I exhaled, the auxiliary hatch shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, accompanied by a faint echo that wasn't mechanical. The silence thickened around me, and I realized something unseen was aware not just of my movements, but of my listening. The sub was no longer just a vessel. I was inside a sentient space, and I hadn't yet passed the test of Rule 6. The bay felt heavier than before, as though the sub itself was aware of my every breath. My flashlight cut through the dim shadows, reflecting off panels and metal surfaces, revealing the usual scuffs and corrosion. But now some panels seemed different. One of the auxiliary panels flickered, erratic, an irregular pulse unlike any routine electrical glitch I had seen. I froze, remembering the stern warning drilled into every newcomer. Rule 7. Never touch a panel that's flickering unnaturally. It wasn't a guideline for laziness. It was a survival directive, and ignoring it could invite catastrophe. Keller's voice came over the comms, asking if I was inspecting the electrical systems. I swallowed hard, avoiding mention of the flickering panel. It was deliberate, malevolent even, as though the sub or something beyond it was testing me. The lights in the bay danced in response to the flicker, elongating shadows along walls and corners. I repeated the rule internally, letting it steady my hands. Rule 7. Never touch a panel that's flickering unnaturally. The moment I considered reaching for it, the bay seemed to breathe, tightening around me. I circled the flickering panel cautiously, flashlight scanning for any anomalies. The shadows shifted as I moved, drawn to the panel without any visible cause. The flicker seemed almost alive, reacting to attention, to movement, to thought. I crouched low, tracing nearby conduits and secondary panels, confirming that nothing had tripped or malfunctioned in the visible circuits. Yet instinct screamed that this was not mechanical. The flicker was deliberate, purposeful, and obeying Rule 7 meant understanding boundaries between human interaction and forces beyond comprehension. The sub vibrated subtly, a low hum of energy that felt different from the usual machinery. I could feel it through my boots, through the soles, and it pressed against my chest like a silent warning. The flickering panel was not an error. It was a message, a signal, a test. My training urged caution, but instinct insisted on obedience. I whispered the rule aloud, grounding myself. Rule 7. Never touch a panel that's flickering unnaturally. Each repetition reaffirmed awareness, a mental barrier against curiosity that could be fatal. The shadows around the bay responded, coalescing near the edges of my vision, but never crossing fully into sight. I crouched near the center, scanning gauges, vents, and conduits, while keeping the flickering panel in view. My mind raced with possibilities: a short circuit, a failing sensor, or something that didn't obey the laws of physics at all. The lights in the bay flickered in tandem with the erratic panel, creating a rhythm that felt like it was communicating. I reminded myself that obeying Rule 7 wasn't optional, it was survival. I took a careful step back, feeling the sub respond to my movement, as if testing boundaries I didn't even realize existed. The flickering panel seemed to pulse with intent, reflecting shadows in strange, impossible angles. I remembered older engineers discussing living electricity, a notion I had dismissed until now. This wasn't about current or circuits. It was about awareness, attention, and respect. Following the rule meant resisting the urge to investigate, to touch, to act impulsively. Rule 7. Never touch a panel that's flickering unnaturally echoed through my mind like a lifeline. Keller's impatience pressed over the comms, demanding status updates. I spoke calmly, avoiding mention of the flicker, focusing on nominal readings elsewhere. The sub seemed to respond to both our presence, the mechanical obedience of instruments, and the intentional awareness of the shadows. The panel flickered more violently now, irregular in a way that seemed impossible. I crouched low, scanning every shadow, every corner, every metal seam, repeating the rule internally as a mantra. Rule 7. Never touch a panel that's flickering unnaturally. A subtle vibration ran through the bay, synchronized oddly with the flicker. My flashlight trembled in my hands as shadows twisted against the walls. The auxiliary hatch seemed denser somehow, closer somehow, even though I hadn't moved. The panel was not just malfunctioning, it was alive, observing, testing, judging. Each flicker was deliberate, intentional, a signal I didn't fully understand. Obeying the rule meant not touching it, not interfering, not acknowledging curiosity. I whispered it under my breath again. Rule 7. Never touch a panel that's flickering unnaturally, hoping awareness alone could protect me. I inched toward the center of the bay, keeping the panel in sight, without making direct contact. The sub's hum shifted subtly, syncing with my pulse, making my hands sweat. Shadows remained at the edges, stretching impossibly, coiling in corners, responding to both presence and silence. The flickering panel felt like it was alive, breathing, waiting for me to make a mistake. I repeated the rule internally once more, letting it root me in caution. Rule 7. Never touch a panel that's flickering unnaturally. Every motion, every breath, every pause mattered now more than ever. A soft metallic scraping echoed faintly across the bay, synchronized with the panel's erratic flash. I froze, holding my flashlight tightly, scanning walls and conduits, every nerve alert. The sub's hum seemed to warp subtly, the shadows shifting in tandem with the flicker, almost as if reacting to my concentration. I understood then that the rule wasn't about electricity or safety, it was about understanding attention, perception, and the unknown. Rule 7. Never touch a panel that's flickering unnaturally became a lifeline in a room that had begun to feel alive in ways I couldn't explain. I crouched near the center, watching the flicker, shadows and subtle vibrations intertwine into something beyond comprehension. I realized the sub was no longer a vessel, it was a living space, a predator, a test. The rule anchored me, reminding me not to intervene in forces I didn't fully understand. I whispered Rule 7 aloud, letting it echo in the bay, a protective chant against impulsive action. The panel's flicker intensified briefly, then slowed, almost contemplatively, as if acknowledging my compliance. Just as I exhaled, the flickering panel dimmed momentarily, and I felt a cold brush against the back of my neck, though nothing was there. Shadows twisted near the hatch in impossible angles, and I realized that ignoring Rule 7 even once could have drawn attention. I might never escape. Something unseen had noticed, and the bay seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next misstep. The bay had grown eerily still, shadows lurking at the edges of my vision, shifting like liquid against steel. I approached the next compartment, feeling a strange resistance in the air, a subtle tension that made my skin prickle. I remembered the warning etched into my training manual, and reinforced by instinct. Rule 8. Always double-check the seals before entering any compartment. On surface-level logic, the seals were simple safety measures against flooding, but experience and the lessons of the shadows had taught me otherwise. They weren't just barriers, they were thresholds between safety and exposure to the unknown. I crouched near the compartment door, flashlight sweeping the area for irregularities. My gloved hands traced the edges, feeling minute variations in texture, subtle cracks and tension that shouldn't exist. The air around the compartment felt heavier, pressing in, almost alive. I ran my hand along the seal, and the shadows shifted subtly in response, as though testing my diligence. Every inch mattered. Rule 8. Always double-check the seals. before entering any compartment wasn't just precaution, it was a lifeline, a measure to ensure I didn't invite danger into a space I could not control. Keller's voice buzzed over the comms, questioning my delay. "Everything all right down there?" he asked, unaware of the currents of tension I felt pressing through the metal. I responded carefully, explaining I was performing routine safety checks, leaving out the part about the subtle movements and pressure changes in the bay. The seals needed attention beyond the mechanical. The shadows and silence demanded mindfulness. I whispered the rule under my breath as I traced the second layer of the seal. Rule 8. Always double-check the seals before entering any compartment, reminding myself that diligence could buy survival. The sub groaned faintly, a vibration that resonated through the deck plates beneath my boots. My flashlight reflected against the metal edges, highlighting tiny imperfections and streaks I hadn't noticed before. These weren't normal wear patterns. They were intentional, almost like traces of something sliding along the steel. My pulse quickened, and I crouched, inspecting each corner meticulously, hands hovering over instruments. The rule became more than words. It was a shield. Following Rule 8 kept me tethered to reason amidst the unnatural, a critical habit in a bay that refused predictability. I stepped closer to the compartment door, listening intently to the subtle hum of the sub. The shadows seemed to respond to my attention, stretching along walls and pipes in unusual angles. I traced the secondary seal, feeling faint irregularities that suggested a breach of perception, if not the steel itself. Obedience to Rule 8 meant more than a mechanical check. It demanded respect, awareness, and patience. I repeated it aloud, letting it reinforce my presence. Rule 8. Always double-check the seals before entering any compartment. A faint vibration ran through the bulkhead, and the air felt colder near the compartment. My heart hammered in my chest as I crouched low, scanning every seam and edge, flashlight illuminating shadows that didn't belong. The first layer of the seal seemed normal, unremarkable, yet instinct told me otherwise. The second layer revealed tiny inconsistencies, almost imperceptible shifts in alignment. The sub was alive, testing, aware, pressing its unknown agenda against my perception. Rule 8. Always double-check the seals before entering any compartment became a mantra, anchoring me in vigilance. The shadows moved again, coalescing near the hatch without crossing fully into light. I crouched, fingers brushing against the edge of the seal, feeling minute differences, subtle resistances, traces of attention from something unseen. The sub's hum vibrated unevenly beneath me, almost deliberately. The lesson of the rule was clear. Even when everything seemed secure, there were forces and presences that could exploit neglect. I whispered it internally, mentally reinforcing the habit. Rule 8. Always double-check the seals before entering any compartment. Keller's impatience pressed through the comms again, demanding progress. I maintained my focus, deliberately ignoring the insistence, keeping attention on every detail. Each seal, each panel, each shadow could hold consequences invisible to the surface. I moved slowly, carefully, methodically, tracing alignment, running hands along every contour, feeling for resistance, subtle shifts and imperceptible vibrations. Rule 8. Always double-check the seals before entering any compartment, guided every movement, preventing a misstep that could expose me to the unseen. I crouched and pressed closer to inspect the hinges, the latches, the pressure locks. Everything seemed normal on the surface, yet the shadows suggested otherwise, moving in rhythm with the imperceptible hum of the sub. The compartment was a threshold, not just of metal and air, but of awareness. Following Rule 8 wasn't just caution, it was recognition that every threshold could harbor something unseen, something patient, waiting for error. I whispered it aloud once more, letting it anchor both body and mind. Rule 8. Always double-check the seals before entering any compartment. Finally, after meticulously checking each layer, each edge, each hinge, I allowed myself to step back, maintaining visual contact with the compartment. The shadows receded slightly, almost satisfied, but I knew it was temporary. Compliance and vigilance had bought me a momentary reprieve, but the shadows, and the unseen forces beyond the hull had not finished their test. The rule wasn't just a precaution, it was a lifeline in a space where assumptions could mean death. I repeated the rule one last time in a whisper. Rule 8. Always double-check the seals before entering any compartment. As I exhaled and leaned back from the compartment, a faint metallic scrape echoed inside the bay, synchronized with a subtle flicker along the edge of the seal. The shadows pooled near the corners, and I realized that no matter how carefully I obeyed Rule 8, something beyond comprehension had already begun to test the next threshold. The sub had grown heavier with each passing hour, shadows pooling unnaturally in every corner. Even the hum of the machinery felt different, distorted, as though it were aware of my solitary presence. I remembered the warnings from training and the stern lessons from the first weeks on board. Rule 9. Never move alone through the shadowed sections of the sub. At the time, it had seemed like basic protocol, a recommendation for safety. Now, after weeks of unexplained events, it became horrifyingly clear that moving alone in the darkness was an invitation for something unseen to observe, follow, and test my every move. I moved cautiously along the main corridor toward the aft section, flashlight slicing through elongated shadows. Each step echoed softly against the metallic hull, a sound I knew could betray me or alert the unseen presences to my awareness. I repeated the rule internally, letting it ground me. Rule 9. Never move alone through the shadowed sections of the sub. It wasn't just advice, it was survival. The shadows here didn't move randomly. They shifted in rhythm with my heartbeat, responding to hesitation, to attention, to fear. The lights flickered faintly as I passed the junction to the secondary passage, shadows coalescing in strange, impossible angles along walls and cables. My pulse raced as I noticed subtle changes in the air currents, tiny vibrations that shouldn't exist. It was as if the sub itself was alive, testing my compliance with the rules, probing my vigilance. Rule 9 demanded awareness, not only of the shadows, but of the environment. The subtle cues the instruments could never detect, the signals the darkness carried beyond human perception. Keller's voice came over the comms, insisting I check the aft machinery, but I hesitated. "I'm proceeding slowly," I replied, trying to mask the rising tension in my voice. I had learned that rushing through the shadows would be fatal. Each step had to be deliberate, methodical, and alert. The rule wasn't about protocol or procedure. It was about understanding that isolation amplified danger in ways the instruments and readings could never measure. Rule 9. Never move alone through the shadowed sections of the sub echoed through my mind, a mantra against impulsive action. As I entered the shadowed corridor, the temperature seemed to drop slightly, a chill pressing against my suit and skin. Shadows twisted unnaturally around cables and walls, merging and separating in patterns that my brain struggled to comprehend. I kept my flashlight focused, scanning every corner, every panel, every seam. The sub seemed to inhale, exhale, and watch, responding to my cautious movements. Following Rule 9 was not about fear. It was about anticipation, about respecting forces beyond comprehension. The faint vibration along the floor intensified as I moved deeper into the corridor. My footsteps were deliberate, slow, measured, but the shadows responded as if conscious, weaving and pooling, testing my focus and discipline. I crouched to inspect a nearby valve, sensing a presence behind me even though nothing appeared in the light. The sub itself seemed to react, the hum synchronizing with my heartbeat, the shadows aligning with the irregularities in vibration. I whispered the rule aloud. Rule 9. Never move alone through the shadowed sections of the sub, grounding myself amidst the oppressive darkness. A subtle metallic scrape echoed from the far end of the corridor, just beyond the range of my flashlight. I froze, listening intently, every nerve taut. The shadows remained, coalescing at the edges of my vision, testing my awareness. The corridor's narrow confines amplified the silence, the absence, the pressure that seemed to follow me step by step. The rule wasn't about superstition, it was about instinct, attention, and survival. Rule 9, never move alone through the shadowed sections of the sub, repeated itself in my mind, like a lifeline. I advanced a few more steps, crouching again to inspect the floor, the cables, the panels. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hands, as shadows shifted closer, following, merging, retreating in rhythm with my attention. The sub's hum became a low vibration through the walls, echoing against the steel, responding to the presence I felt pressing behind and beside me. Obedience to the rule demanded patience, awareness, and restraint. I whispered it aloud again. Rule 9, never move alone through the shadowed sections of the sub, letting it anchor me in the oppressive darkness. The shadows seemed to react to the smallest movements, the shift of my weight, the pause in my breathing, the flicker of the flashlight. I crouched near a maintenance hatch, checking the alignment of bolts and seams. The sub itself seemed to watch, the vibrations becoming irregular, pulses of energy that hinted at intelligence beyond comprehension. Rule 9 was alive in the corridor, guiding me, testing me, warning me. Following it wasn't optional, it was a requirement to survive in a bay where darkness had a mind of its own. A soft hiss of air brushed past my ear, subtle but deliberate. From the far corner of the shadowed corridor, my pulse quickened. I realized that the shadows were not just absence, they were active, conscious observers of my movement. Each micro-vibration, each pause, each shallow breath was noted and responded to. I whispered the rule once more, letting it echo in the bay. Rule 9, never move alone through the shadowed sections of the sub. Compliance, awareness, and discipline were the only tools I had, and even then they might not be enough. As I exhaled, the far end of the corridor darkened further, and a faint metallic scrape echoed in perfect synchronization with my heartbeat. Shadows coalesced unnaturally, and I realized I wasn't just being observed, I was being tested. Moving alone could be a fatal mistake, and something in the sub was waiting for me to break Rule 9. The sub felt impossibly quiet now, almost as if the previous shadows had receded, giving me only a momentary illusion of safety. I approached the life support console, a maze of gauges, dials, and digital readouts glowing faintly under the dim bay lights. I remembered the most critical warning of all, Rule 10, always verify life support systems twice before relying on them. It seemed simple, an almost trivial instruction, but experience had shown me that even the most reliable systems could betray you, particularly when the sub itself seemed alive, watching, and aware of every decision. I crouched in front of the main life support panel, checking oxygen levels, CO2, temperature, and pressure. The readings were normal, or appeared normal, but instinct screamed caution. Machines can fail, yes, but here, something more subtle was at play. Shadows lingered near the corners, silent observers, waiting for the tiniest lapse in judgment. I repeated the rule to myself under my breath. Rule 10, always verify life support systems twice before relying on them, letting it anchor my growing anxiety and insistence on meticulous attention. Keller's voice crackled in my headset, asking if the readings were nominal. I answered cautiously, explaining the normal levels, but not mentioning the flickering of some auxiliary indicators, or the subtle drops in airflow that instruments had temporarily shown. I crouched lower, tracing the ventilation conduits, testing redundancy valves, and checking all filters manually. Obeying the rule wasn't merely a precaution, it was a survival tactic. Every gauge, every display, every switch needed verification. Rule 10, always verify life support systems twice before relying on them, reminded me that even certainty could be deceptive. A faint vibration ran through the deck plates beneath me, synchronized with an irregular hum in the ventilation. My flashlight cut through the bay, illuminating subtle shadows that seemed to twist around the conduits. I could feel the sub itself responding to my attention, the way the shadows shifted almost deliberately to challenge my vigilance. Following Rule 10 demanded more than observation. It demanded active, repeated verification. I whispered the rule aloud, letting it resonate in the empty bay. Rule 10: always verify life support systems twice before relying on them. I traced the auxiliary life support panel along the side wall, feeling faint heat shifts beneath the metal, minor changes in vibration that no instrument registered. The shadows clustered closer to the floor, moving subtly, watching, testing. I repeated each check, cross-referencing the main console, auxiliary valves, and secondary readings, leaving nothing to assumption. The air, though mechanically stable, felt heavier, denser, as if consciousness itself had infiltrated the sub. Rule 10 was no longer a guideline. It was the thin line between staying alive and surrendering to forces beyond comprehension. The lights flickered briefly, synchronized with a soft metallic scrape from the far end of the bay. I froze, knowing instinctively that the sub was testing not only the readings, but my reaction to anomalies. I crouched closer to the main console, tracing each gauge and valve again, double-checking, verifying, reassuring myself. Following Rule 10 was tedious, exhausting, intense, but the shadows didn't allow shortcuts. Every flicker, every whisper, every pause had meaning. I muttered the rule under my breath. Rule 10: always verify life support systems twice before relying on them, allowing it to ground me in vigilance. I moved slowly along the conduits, tracing the ventilation ducts that fed the bay. Each airflow register, each filter vent, each micro valve received careful inspection. Even though everything appeared nominal, I knew better than to trust appearances. Shadows pooled near the corners, elongating unnaturally, testing my patience and focus. Following Rule 10 demanded discipline, repeated attention, and respect for the unknown. I whispered it aloud again, a mantra against both exhaustion and unseen danger. Rule 10: always verify life support systems twice before relying on them. A faint hiss came from a nearby conduit, barely perceptible, yet my training and experience immediately noted the anomaly. I crouched, tracing the air intake valves, and manually testing the flow. Every gauge matched, every display seemed correct, yet instinct screamed that something had shifted. The shadows reacted subtly, merging and retreating with each movement. The sub was alive, monitoring, aware and fully engaged in testing compliance. Rule 10 wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological, forcing vigilance. I repeated it internally, letting it guide my methodical checks. Rule 10: always verify life support systems twice before relying on them. I paused at the secondary life support console, comparing readings with the main panel. Subtle discrepancies appeared in microseconds, almost imperceptible shifts that could have been dismissed as sensor noise. But I couldn't ignore them. The shadows lingered, waiting, pressing, observing my recognition of these irregularities. Each second counted. Following Rule 10 meant obsessing over redundancy, verifying, re-verifying, never assuming normalcy. I whispered the rule aloud, steadying my breathing. Rule 10: always verify life support systems twice before relying on them. Finally, after meticulously checking every panel, valve, gauge, and vent, I stepped back to review the bay. The shadows receded slightly, as if satisfied with my diligence, but I knew better. The sub itself, the shadows, and the unknown forces outside the hull were far from finished. Compliance with Rule 10 had earned me a temporary reprieve, but it had also revealed the sub's sentience, its awareness of my actions, and the importance of unwavering attention. I repeated it one final time, whispering through the tension-filled bay. Rule 10: always verify life support systems twice before relying on them. As I exhaled and leaned against the console, a faint rhythmic metallic tap echoed through the bay, perfectly timed with my heartbeat. Shadows shifted near the auxiliary panels, and I realized the sub had not only observed my checks, it had judged them. One missed verification, one hesitation, could have allowed something unseen to exploit the tiniest lapse in life support. I shivered, repeating Rule 10 in my mind, knowing the next misstep could be fatal. The sub was silent now, more oppressive than before, and I could feel the weight of the deep pressing against the hull. Shadows pooled unnaturally, almost sentient, lingering near every panel and conduit. I remembered the gravest warning of all, Rule 11. Never open the hatch when you feel the ocean watching. It was the culmination of every lesson, every rule, every tension that had built over weeks in isolation. The ocean wasn't just water, it was alive in its awareness, patient and observant, waiting for mistakes, for curiosity to betray me, for hesitation to invite the unseen. I crouched before the hatch, flashlight scanning every detail, every edge, every seam. The metallic surface reflected dim light in uneven angles, and I could swear the shadows around it twisted differently, reacting to my gaze. The sub's hum shifted subtly, irregularly, as if synchronizing with my heartbeat. My mind screamed caution. I repeated the rule aloud, letting it anchor me. Rule 11. Never open the hatch when you feel the ocean watching. It wasn't superstition, it was survival. Keller's voice cut through the comms again, demanding progress, impatience lacing every word. I responded carefully, masking the rising dread in my chest. I crouched lower, feeling the air pressure against my suit, subtle changes that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Shadows pooled in corners, the flickering lights reflecting in ways that defied geometry. I whispered the rule under my breath again. Rule 11. Never open the hatch when you feel the ocean watching, as if saying it aloud could convince the presence beyond the hull that I understood, that I respected its warning. I ran my hands over the hatch's edge, feeling minute vibrations, subtle temperature shifts that no instrument registered. The sub itself seemed alive, a living, breathing entity, observing and responding. The ocean outside pressed against the hull, not just with water, but with intent, waiting for me to act rashly. I crouched, tracing the mechanisms and locks, while repeating Rule 11, letting it guide my thoughts, grounding me against the pressure of isolation and the awareness of unseen eyes. Each microsecond, each tremor, each flicker mattered. The shadows along the floor twisted, merging with the reflections of the dim lights, creating shapes I couldn't identify. A subtle draft swept through the bay, brushing my neck and shoulders, carrying a weight that made the sub feel impossibly larger, impossibly alive. I crouched lower, scanning every seam of the hatch, flashlight trembling slightly in my hands. Obedience to Rule 11 demanded not just restraint, but anticipation, awareness, and respect for forces beyond comprehension. One slip could invite consequences I could not escape. A faint metallic rasp echoed near the hatch, almost imperceptible, but my training and instincts flared immediately. The shadows responded, coiling along the corners and walls as if in rhythm with the sound. The ocean's weight against the hull intensified, subtle currents pressing against the sub like invisible fingers. I whispered the rule aloud again. Rule 11. Never open the hatch when you feel the ocean watching, trying to ground myself in awareness as the pressure in the bay built heavy and suffocating. Keller's impatience flared again over the comms, but I ignored it, crouching closer to the hatch, tracing micro-imperfections, anomalies invisible to any casual observer. Every fiber of my being screamed that the ocean, the sub, and the shadows were aware, responding to both attention and hesitation. The hatch was a threshold not just of metal, but of consequence, and Rule 11 was the final line between compliance and disaster. I whispered it again under my breath, feeling it resonate against the walls and shadows. The temperature dropped suddenly, subtle at first, then more pronounced. The shadows twisted unnaturally along the edges of the hatch, merging and stretching impossibly. The sub vibrated slightly, a pulse that synchronized with my heartbeat, a reminder that every motion, every breath, every twitch of attention mattered. I crouched lower, hands hovering over the hatch's edge without touching, whispering Rule 11 as though it were a lifeline. Rule 11. Never open the hatch when you feel the ocean watching. Awareness alone was my only shield. A faint pressure shift swept through the bay, as if the water outside were inhaling, waiting, assessing. Shadows flickered in impossible patterns, and my flashlight reflected off surfaces in ways that made the hatch seem larger, almost alive. I crouched even closer, tracing seams, locks and edges, repeating the rule both aloud and mentally. The ocean was patient, the sub attentive, and the shadows alert. Rule 11 was no longer just advice. It was survival distilled into a single immutable directive. Finally, I exhaled, crouched low, heart pounding, flashlight trembling, and whispered Rule 11 one last time. The hatch loomed before me, silent, heavy, watched. The sub seemed to hold its breath, shadows pooling near edges, waiting for the next move. The ocean pressed patiently, aware, intelligent, sentient in its inhuman patience. I understood then, fully, that some thresholds were never meant to be crossed, some doors never meant to be opened. And yet the compulsion to obey curiosity, to investigate, to act, loomed dangerously close. As I finally rose, a faint cold pressure brushed my neck, accompanied by a slow, deliberate shift of the shadows near the hatch. My flashlight flickered, and I realized something unseen had observed my every motion, judging my adherence to all 11 rules. The ocean outside was no longer just water, it was a patient, watching presence, aware of every breath, every hesitation, every heartbeat. I knew then that breaking Rule 11 even once could be the last act of any human aboard. The sub was alive, and the deep waited. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.